Welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon Huang, and I'm the owner of the Wellness Center right up here. We have therapeutic massage, acupuncture, chiropractic care, and naturopathic medicine. Tonight we have Dr. Tiffany Binder talking about low-carb eating and the paleo diet, basically. And so it should be a great talk. A little bit about Dr. Binder. She's been practicing for over 11 years in the Denver community. She specializes in a variety of different health issues, from weight loss to gut digestive issues, chronic fatigue, adrenal issues. She has a wide array of tools in her toolbox. So she's a gifted practitioner, which you will, I'm sure, get to know. And this talk was also sponsored by the Meetup group, the Paleo Diet group. So I don't know if anyone wanted to talk a little bit about it, but there is a Meetup group in the community if anyone's interested, and a lot of the members are here tonight.
Good evening. How many of you are already following a low-carb diet or have done so in the past? Okay, fair amount of you. So can anyone tell me why they think that eating low-carb is a good idea? Does anyone have some thoughts? Yes, blood sugar is a great one. Anything else? Well, tonight we're going to talk about a huge, long list of reasons why eating low carb is beneficial for your heart and your body and your mind and every piece of you. So as I make points, I'm going to start making a list, and I'm going to write them down, all the reasons why lowering your carb intake is a good idea. And at the end, we'll see this big, wonderful, long list. I'm also going to talk about the three main food groups: carbohydrates, of course, protein, and fat. So for some, it might be a review, but I'm going to go in depth into all of those categories. So hopefully at the end, you'll see how what I believe is food is your best medicine. There's nothing that can replace how we eat. No drugs, no supplements, although I am a fan of supplements. Nothing can replace food is the primary best medicine. Food is your best medicine. And how many were at the talk last week for heart disease? Okay, so I'm going to repeat a little bit of that, so a little bit of review so that we can all talk about how eating low carb is good for your heart. So I'm going to draw a little bit of a picture, and I'm not sure how I'm going to draw and talk at the same time, but I'll come back and forth. Actually, I'll just hold this. So I'm going to draw a picture of a carbohydrate, and we probably mostly know that they're designated between simple and complex carbohydrates. So I'm drawing the structure, basic structure of a simple carbohydrate up here. And simple carbohydrates obviously are white table sugar and cake and candy and all that kind of sugar pop. And on the bottom here is a complex carbohydrate. Complex carbohydrates are potatoes, pasta, bread, cereals, grains. So a simple carbohydrate, and this is kind of what I talked about last week as far as carbohydrates go. Simple carbohydrate, I'm going to use the example of white table sugar, which is sucrose. Sucrose is made up of sugar molecules that are hooked together with bonds with other sugar molecules in a straight chain. That's why it's called a simple carbohydrate, because it's one straight chain. Now, sucrose is made up of glucose, which is your blood sugar, glucose molecules, and fructose molecules. Fructose is found in fruit. So glucose and fructose in one straight chain. Comparing that to, I like to use the example of a potato without the skin. A potato is also sugar molecules hooked together with bonds, but it is in a branched chain. A potato is actually pure glucose molecules, pure sugar. So all the other complex carbohydrates like rice, bread, pasta, they're all sugar molecules as well. The only difference mainly between the simple and the complex carbohydrate is the structure of the molecule. The base units are the same. So complex carbohydrates also can have fiber molecules attached here, but it doesn't take away from the sugar. Fiber just slows the absorption rate down of the sugar. So anyway, when we eat these simple or complex carbohydrates, we start to digest them in our mouth, which means take these bonds off, and we swallow and we finish digesting, which means all these bonds have been broken off, and now we have these free-floating sugar molecules in our gut. So when you look at this, you know, without knowing this, it very much looks the same now that it's broken down. This is glucose and fructose, and this is glucose. So all along the gut wall, we have tiny little pores. So now these sugar molecules can pass through the pores of the wall of the digestive tract and go right into the bloodstream and raise our blood sugar. And we all know what that feels like, right? We've had a blood sugar rush. So, but we don't necessarily have to feel it. We don't have to feel anything. So the sugar goes into the blood and raises the blood sugar. This is from the simple carbohydrate, and this is from the complex carbohydrate. The next thing that comes out is a hormone called insulin. Insulin shows up like a taxi cab and says, okay, sugar, where do you want to go? And let's say we ate sugar. So now you know what I mean by when I say sugar. I mean simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. They're all sugar. So they all turn to sugar in our blood and raise our blood sugar. So when I say sugar, I don't just mean simple, I mean complex. So the blood sugar goes up after eating either one of those. In fact, I don't even differentiate between simple and complex. I call them fibrous and non-fibrous, but we'll get to that in a minute. So insulin shows up, and let's say we ate some dinner with some carbs, and like potato or pasta, and then we're tired, so we sat and watched some TV and went to bed. Mostly, that sugar that we just ate is probably not going to be used for any fuel. So that sugar is going to be taken, insulin's going to take the sugar out of the blood and transport it and convert it into saturated fat, and we store that on our body. We're really good at doing this. When we used to live on the land, which really wasn't that long ago, we had quite different choices to eat. We didn't have all the concentrated packaged carbohydrates that we do now. And so, but our genetics are really good at storing sugar as fat or storing extra energy that we have eaten that we don't burn into fat, because later we might be needing to use that. If a herd of buffalo came along and we ate, you know, to our heart's content, we didn't have a refrigerator. Our body is the refrigerator. So we would store all that food or sugar or whatever we ate as extra fat for later. So we're really good at doing that. Body doesn't like to have elevated blood sugar very long. Okay, so let's say we ate the potato dinner and then we went for a walk or a jog or some kind of exercise. So the insulin would take the sugar in the blood, take it out of the blood, and transport it to a muscle cell. And we will use that for energy. But in either case, so we have two choices after we eat sugar. We either burn it or store it. Those are our two choices. So in either case, our blood sugar starts to come down, right? Because we've put it over there. And insulin starts to come down. However, insulin has a long half-life. It stays high in the blood for hours after we've eaten it. It doesn't degrade very fast. So even if we have burned the sugar we just ate or we stored it away for later and the blood sugar is starting to come down, the body says, oh, I need some fuel here. I need to get some fuel. So we have a couple choices when that happens. We can either, ideally, well, we can eat, but if we don't have food around or it's not mealtime, then we should be able to dip into our own fat storage and use that for energy. Open up our natural refrigerator and use that for energy. However, as I mentioned, insulin stays high for hours. So if insulin is still high, we cannot dip into our own fat storage. When insulin is present in the blood, it stores sugar as fat. Stores sugar as fat. The opposite reaction cannot occur. You cannot take fat out of the cell to burn it. So we can't access our own energy. We can't even get to our own fuel. So energy can drop. We can get really tired because the body says, oh, I don't have any energy here. And so we actually have one other option, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, which is if we can't get into our own fat storage and we don't have any food available, then we actually dip into our own muscle and bone, and we break down our own muscle and bone, which is a risk for bone loss and osteoporosis. So I'm going to start making a list because I just mentioned a couple things here, benefits of eating low carb. Well, when we eat high carb, we can't burn fat. So burning fat efficiently is one benefit of eating a low carb diet. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then osteoporosis or bone loss. Osteoporosis. I'm going to come back to this, but I'm just going to start making some notes here. Okay. So if we eat the diet that's been recommended to us by the AMA or the government, which is, who knows what it is, high complex carbohydrates, low saturated fat. That's what's told to us to eat. And by the way, since that diet has been recommended, heart disease has become the number one killer for men and women, and I'm going to talk about that, how that's connected. Obesity just continues to rise, and the diseases associated with obesity continue to rise, diabetes, and there's a whole long list. Okay, so let's see. So if I eat the diet that's been recommended, by the American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, here I go. Here's my plate, and I'm going to eat what I've been told, which is for dinner, maybe I'll have a piece of protein, chicken, fish, and then because it's low saturated fat, it's less saturated fat than red meat or something. Then I'm going to have maybe a potato, but no butter, right, because no saturated fat. And then maybe some other things, but maybe a dessert afterwards, but no fat, a low-fat dessert. So I eat all of this, and let's say I had a late night, so I ate that for dinner and I went to bed. Well, that potato and that dessert definitely not going to be burned, so I'm going to store that sugar in the form from the potato and the dessert right into saturated fat. So you see how this makes no sense. On my plate, I put low saturated fat, high complex carbs, but the carbs immediately turn to saturated fat. That diet makes no scientific sense whatsoever. I can put it on my plate nicely like that, but it doesn't turn out so nice there. Okay, so if I do eat like this, if I'm eating every meal, which is high complex carbs, low saturated fat, and I don't happen to, if I have a desk job or I'm not burning those carbs right afterwards, every time I eat a meal, I'm going to raise my blood sugar and my insulin's going to go up, and I'm going to store that sugar as fat that I don't burn. But the problem is that, remember I said insulin stays high for hours after I eat. So what happens is insulin just ends up staying high all day, never comes down. So fat burning is absolutely impossible. And for many of us, if we're eating that way for months, years at a time, the insulin goes so high that even at night while we're sleeping, when it should be coming down, because we're not eating, we're not eating anything while we're sleeping, so it's not going to stimulate our blood sugar and insulin to go up. So at night, it should come down. But for some of us, when we're eating that way, insulin never comes down. So we never can dip into our fat burning. So the next thing that is the problem with insulin floating around, not only can't we burn fat, but insulin is very damaging to the inner lining of the arteries. So last week I talked a lot about this, so I'm going to kind of be short because a lot of this is review still from last week. Insulin, so here's an artery, and an artery is lined with cells on the inside, and the way I like to describe it, describe heart disease basically in a nutshell is, let's say I cut my hand. I have systems in place that immediately start to repair that tissue when I cut myself. Well, first of all, I bleed to get all the bacteria kind of out so that no bacteria on the surface of the cell start to circulate in. And then I start to clot, because if I didn't do that, I would bleed to death from actually one tiny cut. So I clot, and the body is amazing because we don't even have to think about this. So we clot, and then I need to manufacture new cells to fill in that gap here, and I may form a scar. there's other processes that happen. Inflammation can occur. So same thing inside the arteries. There is a whole list of things that we know that can create damage inside the arteries, and insulin insulin causes damage inside the arteries. So the same thing happens inside here. If I have irritation or a cut like this, then from insulin floating around in the blood. In fact, there was some research done where they put insulin into the artery. I don't know if it was a dog or some kind of animal, unfortunately. And what they found after hours of doing this is that the artery just became laden with plaque. And the reason is that any damage that occurs inside the arteries, the body does the same thing to repair it like it does on the cut of the hand. So we start to, if we bleed from this area, we start to clot, which isn't such a great thought inside the artery. Then we maybe have some inflammation, and then we need to manufacture new cells to heal that area. And inside the artery, a scar is called plaque, and that's how plaque gets laid down. So over time, if we continue to do that, the artery starts to clog, and then if we clog the artery that feeds the heart, or any part of the heart, that's a heart attack. So there's a list of things that we know of that can cause damage, not just cholesterol, which is what we talked about last week. 50% of heart attack victims had normal cholesterol. Normal. So insulin is a very important factor in heart disease. That's why type 2 diabetics get heart disease much more rapidly than the average person, because type 2 diabetes have very high insulin. They're just insulin resistant and they can't use it. So anyway, we'll add one more thing to our list of reasons why low carb is good. So it reduces the risk of heart disease. And also, eating low carb reduces your triglycerides. So if we've had a regular blood panel, usually triglycerides are involved with that. And triglycerides are just a fancy word for fat floating in the blood. And the reason that they would be floating there is if we can't burn fat very well. So they start building up in our arteries as well. So having triglycerides high means that someone is eating more carbohydrates than they can burn. And they can come down very quickly. So you can actually get your triglycerides down, depending on how high they are, in a few days if you just stopped eating so many carbs. So it lowers the triglycerides, which is also important for heart disease. And also it lowers blood pressure. So when insulin goes up, it triggers the kidneys to hold on to sodium. And wherever sodium goes, water follows. So we hold on to fluid, and our blood pressure goes up. We may not even know that we're holding on to fluid, but we have high blood pressure. That's the most common cause of elevated blood pressure, is holding on to extra fluid caused by insulin. So it's very easy to get someone's blood pressure to come down. In fact, we have to be very careful. When I change someone's diet and they're really ready to go for it, we have to measure their blood pressure morning and night to make sure that it's not coming down too fast, because they need to reduce their medication. They have to reduce their medication, which is a great thing. So it reduces blood pressure. BP, and then it reduces triglycerides. And then the gentleman back there said blood sugar, glucose. So that's actually the most obvious thing that lowering your carbohydrates would do, is lower your blood sugar. And most people don't think about blood sugar much unless they are diabetic. But we all, I used to work with a physician that said we all have diabetes. And diabetes just means blood sugar. And some people have higher amounts of blood sugar, and some people don't have as high, but they still have blood sugar floating around. And it can go up very high right after they eat some carbohydrates. And the problem with, what's the problem with elevated blood sugar? What might be a problem with that? So most people think that it's bad, but we don't really know why. Oh, thanks for coming. So when blood sugar goes high, whether it's high all the time because someone's diabetic or just high right after we ate a carbohydrate meal, sugar in your hands is sticky, right? When you get like sugar, it's sticky. It's sticky in the blood too, and it sticks to things. It sticks to proteins floating in the blood. It can stick to nerves. It can stick to proteins and nerves and various things. And when it sticks to those things, it actually forms a bond with it and makes something called an age product. And age is an acronym for another word, but it really does what it sounds like it does. It ages us. Aging just is accumulation of damage over time. We're all aging, and aging just means accumulation of damage. So we can actually control the rate of aging. Isn't that amazing? By what we eat, because these age products damage tissue. And the tissue that is extremely sensitive to this are the tissue that most people who have diabetes have been warned about, you know, their eyes, their kidneys, and their nerves. People who get neuropathy in their feet, numbness and tingling and pain. But age products damage the inside of the arteries, damages the whole body. I mean, wrinkles are actually this process I'm talking about, which is called glycation. Sugar sticking to proteins, forming these age products, is called glycation. Glycation is one of the main reasons how we age. So, age spots on our skin is a process of glycation. So, anyway, that's the reason that we don't want to have our blood sugar high, because it does cause damage. So, both blood sugar and insulin create damage inside our body. So I can put number 6 down, basically in the category of aging. Did you have a question? So she asked if our blood sugar is high, does that make us hungry? And absolutely, because usually with high blood sugar, we're going to have high insulin. And then when insulin is high, we can't dip into our own fat storage. So normally we should be able to dip into our own fat storage between meals and at night while we're sleeping. But if we can't access that very well, then we're going to have to eat to get our fuel. Either that or we're going to burn our muscle and bone. So, and actually you brought up a really great point. Thank you very much. The one thing that I was going to talk about is a hormone called leptin. Has anyone heard of leptin? So leptin is more of a newly discovered hormone. It was discovered in 1995, which is pretty new for science. And it is a hormone made by fat. So we used to think that fat just sat there and it did nothing on our body, and we just wished that it would go away, but it didn't really do anything, had no intelligence whatsoever. But fat is actually kind of smart because it secretes hormones that communicate with other parts of the body, mainly the brain. So let's say I ate this meal here and I couldn't burn my dessert and my potato, so of course that sugar gets stored as fat. And as soon as that sugar gets converted and stored as fat, leptin gets made. Leptin, the fat cell makes leptin, and it travels to the brain, and there's a part of the brain that listens to leptin. So if I'm eating more carbs than I can burn and I'm storing the rest for later, leptin goes to the brain and tells the brain that, hey brain, I ate more than I need at the moment, so I'm storing extra for later. Stop the appetite. So it's a feedback mechanism to tell the person that they don't need to eat anymore, which is great because otherwise we might just keep eating. However, if we have insulin floating around high all the time, this means that we're probably eating carbohydrates in each meal like we've been told to do. And so every time we're eating, we may store some extra, even just a little bit. Doesn't take much, actually. Little sugar stores a little bit of fat, and leptin gets made. So pretty soon, leptin's floating around in the blood high all the time, too, because it doesn't get degraded very fast like insulin. So leptin is constantly floating around. You can actually measure these hormones in the blood. So leptin is floating around all the time, and if leptin is all the time there, the brain stops listening to it. says, I don't hear anything, do you? Because if you were in a room that smelled like trash, if we smelled trash and we stayed there all day, we'd actually fill up our sense receptors in our nose, saturate them enough that we don't smell it much. And someone walked in the room, they'd say, woo, it's really stinky in here. So the receptors in here for leptin become totally saturated and they can't hear the message of leptin. So if they don't hear leptin, they think the brain thinks we don't have fat. If we don't have fat, it's an emergency. We need to eat. So the brain turns on our hunger center, and usually what we crave is carbohydrates because they're immediate fuel, because we're starving. We need something quick. So you can see how hunger has everything to do with this whole process. If the body can't access fat just here, it needs to eat to get some fuel. But when leptin is high, the body doesn't even know it has fat to burn. So we can be walking around with plenty of fuel stored on our body and have no way of accessing it. And we're hungry all the time. Okay. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing about fat is, the other thing about leptin is that when someone has leptin floating around high all the time, and it actually, the research shows that it changes our taste receptors in our mouth and makes it so that we will eat more sweet to get satisfied. Because if the body is really needing some sugar, we're going to need to eat a lot. And so the taste of sweet is not as strong. If our leptin level is down and we don't really, we're body thinks we're fine, we're not starving, then things taste very sweet. So when people have leptin and insulin floating around high all the time, things taste different. When leptin and insulin levels come down, because we're eating a lower carbohydrate diet, takes a few weeks to start to have those hormones come down, then suddenly we taste an almond and it tastes sweet. Green beans taste sweet. Our whole taste receptors change. Okay. So another reason why eating low carb is good is that, as I was talking about, if our insulin is high, and it doesn't get a chance to come back down at night. So if we ate a high carbohydrate meal before we went to bed, our insulin is going to stay high for at least several hours, if not the whole night. And we need fuel while we're sleeping. We do quite a bit of things while we're sleeping. We do a lot of healing. Our bones break down and turn over. We do healing at night. Our heart's beating. We dream. We do need some fuel. And since we're not eating, we should be able to, it would be nice to be able to dip into the fat storage, which is what we're supposed to be able to burn. But if insulin's present, we can't. And so what happens at night is the blood sugar starts to come down, and if we can't get what we need, this is a stress. And it actually it tells the adrenal glands that sit right back here on top of the kidneys. They're the fight or flight glands. They pump out cortisol or epinephrine, the stress hormone, adrenaline, because it's a stress. Oh my goodness, our blood sugar is dropping and we have no fuel. And this all can be done, sometimes it wakes us up because our blood sugar drops, but sometimes it doesn't, because what cortisol does when it goes in the blood is it actually serves to break down your own muscle tissue and bone to raise your blood sugar so that we can get through the night. So we're actually using muscle while we're sleeping. And so the problem too is that having cortisol floating around is not such a great idea. Cortisol is not good for the arteries either. We know that stress is not so great we intuitively know that heart disease can be associated with stress. A lot of diseases can be associated with stress, and cortisol can cause damage inside the arteries. In fact, it switches us into what's called a parasympathetic nervous system mode. So we have two nervous systems modes that we are in. Sympathetic, which is like fight or flight, which some people go on all day long, drinking coffee all day to get through the day. And and then the parasympathetic nervous system is what we want to be in when we're eating, because that's what the digestive system, that's how we digest, in the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the more relaxed state. But when cortisol is floating around, it will switch us into the sympathetic nervous system drive. It actually makes us think we're in a stressful situation. So it doesn't make for good sleep. It doesn't make for good mood. It makes us feel anxious and tired. So that's another reason for low-carb eating, is it lowers our, it keeps our cortisol lower and makes us more into a parasympathetic nervous system. When we burn fat, we are going to be more in a parasympathetic nervous system drive. In fact, when we burn sugar, because we're eating it, if we eat sugar, we're going to burn sugar. When we are burning sugar, we're really not supposed to be burning sugar, actually, much at all. Sugar is only there for emergencies. We've stored sugar conveniently in our muscles in the form of glycogen and some in the liver, but not enough to last us an entire day. So we're not supposed to be burning sugar. We're supposed to be burning fat. We have plenty of fat for many, many days stored on our body. And so if we're burning sugar, it tells the body that we must be under stress, because sugar is supposed to be an emergency, like if a tiger is chasing us. Luckily, we have sugar in the muscle, and we can use that right away to run quickly away from the tiger. And if we run out of that in the muscle, the liver lets a little go in the blood, and we can use that for energy. So when we're burning sugar because we're eating it, it actually tells the body we must be stressed. So it actually puts us more into a sympathetic nervous system drive, which is the stressful state, fight or flight. So when we burn fat, by mere fact that we're burning fat, it puts us into a parasympathetic nervous system drive. We can't burn fat if cortisol is floating around. Cortisol blocks fat burning too. Cortisol raises blood sugar to prepare us to run and fight. Does that make sense? Okay, so eating low carb reduces our level of stress hormone. It also, eating low carb, high insulin levels can interfere with our neurotransmitters in our brain, like serotonin. And so high insulin levels have an effect on our mood and can cause us to be depressed. There's so many other reasons that I'm not going to talk about tonight that eating low carb is great, but when we have lots of sugar floating around, we have more of and also eating sugar, in our gut, we have like trillions of bacteria in our gut. Isn't that amazing? Trillions of bacteria living in our gut, and they all need to be in good balance. So we have a little bit of yeast that grows in the gut naturally, but when we eat sugar, yeast love sugar, and they tend to have a party and multiply. And so has anyone heard of Candida before? So Candida is the result of the yeast kind of going crazy, and it can cause, the yeast can excrete toxins into the body that affect neurotransmitters, so it can make us feel depressed and actually have digestive problems as well. Okay, so eating low carb helps our digestive system too. Okay, what else? Oh, cancer. So number one, cancer cells love sugar. They can't burn fat. They burn sugar. So when we eat sugar, we have cancer cells floating around in the blood all the time. We're constantly, fighting them off, really, and which is great. Our immune system is always working quite diligently, and so we don't want to fuel those cells. But I don't want you to lose sleep over that one. We could make ourselves crazy thinking, "Oh my God, I had some sugar." But when we're eating lots of carbs and our insulin goes up, as I was talking about, of course, we store fat. And the more fat we store, as I was mentioning, leptin gets secreted by fat cells, but estrogen is secreted by fat cells too. Did you know that? Estrogen actually gets secreted by fat cells. Estrogen is a female hormone. Men have a little, normally. And so that's why having more fat on our body is a risk for breast cancer and prostate cancer, which are hormone cancers, hormone-related cancers. So even men, when they have more fat on their body, will actually secrete estrogen. You can measure the estrogen in the body, and it goes up for men, and that is harmful for their prostate. They also are at risk for breast cancer too. But prostate cancer for men is related to high estrogen in the body, and it also can cause the prostate to enlarge, not just cancer, but it also can cause enlargement of the prostate. Oh, great question. So she was asking, is it all cancers that are related, or is it just the cancers related to hormones like breast cancer and prostate cancer? It's related to all cancers. Yeah. So I was only talking about fat there for a minute and how estrogen gets produced by fat. But insulin has been linked to increasing the risk of cancer, high insulin levels. Insulin resistance has been linked to cancer, all the cancers. Maybe I shouldn't say all, most cancers. Some cancers we don't understand. There's some brain tumors we don't quite understand. But, okay, so I'm kind of running out of room on my list, but was I on 8? 9? Okay. Cancer. Well, I think you get the point. Let me just make sure I haven't forgotten anything that I really wanted to say. I was talking about osteoporosis and bone loss, and I was talking about how we burn, if we're going to burn bone, if we can't burn fat, we burn muscle and bone if we can't burn fat. The other thing is that when insulin is high, it triggers the kidneys to excrete calcium, so we can't hold on to calcium very well. So it promotes the excretion of calcium. So insulin is not such a great thing to have floating around. And so if we think about when we used to live on the land, as I was talking about earlier, that our diet is, our food supply is way different than now. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to wonder why all these chronic diseases are so rampant. Most of the top chronic diseases are completely preventable. Heart disease, obesity, a lot of the other type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is just going up thousands of percent every several years. And diabetes is just a manifestation of eating. I mean, certainly genetics play a part. So if we had all of us in a room and we ate high complex carbohydrate meal and everyone ate the same, some people would have high triglycerides, some people wouldn't. Some people would gain weight more than others. Some people would maybe get diabetes and some people wouldn't, and that has to do with genetics. So some people really have to be much more attuned to eating lower carbohydrates, and some people can get away with eating a little bit more. But certainly if you have risk for heart disease, if you are overweight, if you have risk for cancer and diabetes, eating a lower carbohydrate would be a smart move. So one other thing before I move on to talking about protein is that we did some studies. We had a lot of patients coming into the office, and we were doing blood work for them, and before and after starting a low-carb diet, and we saw many things happen. It was very exciting. But one thing that was interesting that not very many people had known about is that it actually, eating lower carb, getting your insulin levels down, actually makes the thyroid more efficient. So insulin has been shown to interfere with your own thyroid hormone, which is involved with your metabolism. It's also involved with all of your hormones. And so the thyroid actually becomes more efficient. It doesn't, when insulin is interfering with the action of the thyroid hormone, then the body thinks, oh, my thyroid hormone isn't working, I must not be making enough, so it has to try and make more. And so there's a lot of folks that have hypo or low thyroid problems that actually sometimes can reduce their medication many times by changing their diet, because their body becomes more efficient. And then, of course, insulin and leptin levels. And when I'm talking about insulin, I also mean leptin. Insulin and leptin levels cause all these problems and create a lot of inflammation in the body. And inflammation is a big buzzword for the last few years in connection with all chronic disease. Okay, so when people start eating lower carb, one mistake that often happens is they start to eat high protein. It's very easy to do that because we're not doing carbs, and so we start to eat tons of protein. And the problem with that is that, well, basically there's two major reasons why we eat. One is for replacement of parts and repair. So every day we're breaking down tissue and rebuilding it, and we need protein for that. And the other reason we want to eat is for energy, and we want to be a fat burner. We want to burn fat. We won't be a fat burner if we eat sugar. If we eat sugar, we're going to burn sugar. If we don't eat sugar, we're going to burn fat. It's simple as that. So, but we only need a certain amount of protein for parts. So if we eat more protein in the meal than we actually can utilize right away for parts, the body actually takes the protein molecule and takes a nitrogen group off the protein, and it turns into a carb. Protein actually raises our blood sugar if we eat too much. So basically, how do you decide how much to eat? You know, it's all very confusing, and I'm not talking about specifics right now. I'm just giving you reasons why lower carb is important. We can talk more specifics, but in terms of protein, most people, it depends on how tall you are and like how much lean tissue you have. We could do a body composition to figure out how much lean body mass, like muscle and bone, you have to see how much protein you require, and also your activity level. So if you're very active, then you're going to need more protein than if you're not so active. But in general, this is in general, if someone's not overly active, like an athlete, around 20-some grams of protein per meal is good. Now, there's 7 grams of protein per ounce of meat, like chicken, fish, turkey, beef. So that means only around 3 or so ounces of protein at any one time. It's not very much. It's kind of like the palm of the hand, 3 or 4 ounces of protein. And you know, we go out to dinner and we get 8 ounces of steak, and some of that is 3 ounces of that or so is going to be used for parts, and the rest is just going to actually raise our blood sugar and our insulin, and we store the rest as fat. So we want to be mindful of not overeating protein. Yes, great question. She was asking if it would be better to divide your protein throughout the day rather than eat one meal of like 8 ounces. And that's a great question because the body doesn't store protein. So if we knew we weren't going to be able to eat much for the day or something, we're busy. So we decided to eat this huge protein breakfast to get us through the day. It doesn't work like that. The body will only use what it can at that moment and then turns the rest to sugar. We don't store protein. I mean, you could call our muscle storing protein, but that's only, we don't store extra protein to use for later like we do fat. So it is good to eat throughout the day. It's especially nice to eat sometime in the morning. You don't have to eat exactly right when you wake up, but it's good to have some protein in the morning, especially because we've been fasting all night, and we need some protein because if we don't have the protein we need for parts, then we're actually going to just steal from our own muscle to use that. So it's really good to have some protein in the morning. Did you have a question? is it better to eat before or after you exercise? Well, yeah, I think, you mean in the morning time, like waking up and going and working out? Well, kind of both. It kind of depends on when you're exercising. So if you're going to go in the morning, yes, definitely I would eat some protein before you work out, because otherwise your body's going to break down muscle tissue. And actually what's kind of nice is to exercise, although this isn't always so convenient, but exercising after your last meal at night. Because, if someone is eating low carb, you don't have to do much exercise to maintain your weight level. You don't have to do strenuous, intense exercise to maintain health. But so going for a walk, even within an hour after you eat, is very good, because even if you're eating low carb, broccoli has carbs in it, and so if you're walking after your last meal at night, you're going to burn up those remnants of carbs, and then you're real good to go to bed at night. So I would say that eating after is important too, if you're doing heavy workout. So if you're doing a heavy workout, you really do need to replenish your stores by eating some. But if you're not going to eat, if you're not doing a heavy exercise, it's good to exercise after. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing, but okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to fat now. Does anyone have any other questions about protein? So if we're not eating many carbs and we're not eating a whole bunch of protein, what are we eating? Well, the answer is some fat. And we've been brainwashed, literally, to think that fat makes us fat and is bad for us. Now, of course, there's different types of fat, So not all are good. And there's three basic types of fat. There's monounsaturated fats, which are like olive oil and avocados and macadamia nuts. That's monounsaturated. And then polyunsaturated, there's a lot of different kinds of polyunsaturated fats, mostly vegetable oils, which are not so good. But also fish oil is in that category, so that's good. We'll talk about that. And then saturated fat. Saturated fat is mostly a fat that is found from an animal source. So the saturated fat, which would be in cheese or milk or beef. Coconut oil is also saturated, but that's not from an animal source. Butter. So when we say we are what we eat, that's true when we talk about fat, but it's not true when we talk about carbohydrates. Okay? So when we eat sugar, we don't turn into sugar, right? We turn into fat if we don't burn it. But when we eat fat, we actually turn into more of the type of fat we're eating. So we have trillions of cells, and I mentioned we have trillions of bacteria that live in the gut. We also have trillions of cells in our whole body, trillions, and every cell has a cell membrane. It's like a coat around it. And whatever kind of fat we're eating, we actually incorporate more of that fat into the cell membrane. So if we're eating more fluid fats like olive oil and that kind of thing versus saturated fat like lard or butter, then we're going to incorporate, or fish oil, which is good, fluid. If we're eating more fluid, healthy fish oil and olive oil, we're going to incorporate that more into the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is going to be more fluid versus the harder saturated fat that gets incorporated into the cell membrane. You've seen saturated fat at room temperature. It's hard, right? So the cell membrane becomes more rigid. And so nutrients that are trying to get into the cell, all the cells need nutrients, and waste products trying to exit the cell, it's much more difficult when the cell membrane has more saturated fat on it. Also, when insulin is trying to work with the cell, it's like the cell has earmuffs. It can't hear the message of insulin. So if the cells can't hear the message of insulin, the body thinks, I better scream louder, so I better make more insulin. So we even make more insulin which is, so fat actually, the kind of fat we eat has a lot to do with eating healthy low-carb eating. Let's see here. The other thing is the kind of food that animals eat. If we're eating chicken or even eggs or beef, we want to know what are those animals eating. So if we're eating beef that is grain-fed, now where in nature has beef ever, cows ever grazed on grain? They don't. They graze on grass and, their natural surroundings. But we give them buckets of grain. Why? Because we want to fatten them up. So all that grain raises their blood sugar and their insulin. They store all that as saturated fat. So if we're eating animals that have been fed grain, we're going to eat a lot of saturated fat. So if we're eating animals that have been grass-fed, grass has a lot of omega-3. Omega-3 is found in fish oil and also green leafy things. So that's why grass-fed beef is so good, because it's going to have a lot of omega-3 and not as much saturated fat. Even the eggs that we buy, you've probably seen the cartons that say high omega-3, because those chickens have been fed not grain, but flax seeds and algae, which are going to allow the chickens to have a lot more omega-3. Now, I'm glad we brought eggs up. Eggs are an important topic. Eggs are so misunderstood. I feel so sorry for eggs. Eggs are fabulous. Okay? Eggs have everything inside the egg. Has the nutrition inside the egg can make a life, a chick, Everything, nothing else needs to be added. And so it has a lot of nutrients in there that are healthy for us. Not as healthy if we're eating high saturated fat eggs. However, that brings up a whole topic that I don't think I want to go into. But I can tell you that people don't get heart disease because they ate too many eggs. And I have vegetarians and vegans in my practice that don't ever eat eggs, and they have high cholesterol. It really has not much to do with the problem with heart disease and cholesterol. And in fact, the inside of the egg has a lot of nutrition for people. So if you want to talk to me more about eggs, we can talk more about that. But one important thing about eggs is the way you cook them. So inside the yolk, that omega-3, right? If the chicken was eating grass, it's going to have high omega-3. And omega-3, fish oil, remember I said omega-3 is found in fish oil and green veggies, green leafy veggies. And it's very sensitive to the elements. So heating it and light and oxygen cause oils in general to perhaps go rancid. It's called oxidation. And oxidation of oils, if we eat oxidized oils, it creates free radicals. And so we've heard of free radicals. We've heard of taking antioxidants. Antioxidants help free radicals. And so anyway, we don't want to eat rancid oils. So if we're cooking an egg, we want to make sure to take care of that omega-3. So cooking an egg underwater is the best because the water temperature can't heat up as high as a frying pan. Scrambling an egg, especially if you're taking the egg that has high omega-3, is very doomed to becoming oxidized. And oxidized cholesterol and fat within the yolk is very damaging. Yes, that is very damaging. So oxidized cholesterol by scrambling an egg, because if you're scrambling it, you're exposing a lot of surface area to the yolk, a lot of heat and oxygen, which will cause it to oxidize and become rancid. So cooking eggs underwater is the best, like poaching it or soft boiling or hard boiling. If you're going to scramble an egg, do just the egg whites. That's better. If you are still going to scramble an egg with the yolk, use the eggs that have high saturated fat because saturated fat is much more stable. Saturated fat doesn't oxidize very well, which is good. We like that. Okay. In terms of cooking it? Yes, absolutely. Oil is very sensitive to heat. and light and oxygen. So if you buy some oil off the shelf there, and it's been sitting on the shelf for a long time, exposed to light, because it's not in a dark container. Dark containers are very good to block the light, and you want to make sure that it's come from a good place, because who knows what kind of heat it's been exposed to on the way, or even the processing of it. It could be rancid just sitting on the shelf. And so oils are very sensitive, and so when you cook them, you don't want to cook them at high temperatures. Olive oil tends to be, of the liquid oils, tends to be more stable at higher temperatures, but you still want to keep it at a medium temperature. You don't want to heat it up, otherwise it oxidizes. Sometimes you can, yeah. I mean, with fish oil, you really can. Fish oil is extremely sensitive to this process. I tend to be what I call a fish oil snob. And I would say that a huge percentage of the fish oil sitting on the counter, on the shelf, is rancid, because the processing of it has to be very careful, taking it out of the fish and putting it into liquid or to the capsules. Many times it becomes rancid. I only carry a couple different kinds of fish oil in our pharmacy that I know how it's been processed, and it's not as oxidizable. And also the capsules tend to be permeable to oxygen. So even if the processing was great, the oxygen can pass through the wall of the capsule and oxidize at that point too. So if you have fish oil capsules at home, you could actually do a little experiment. You could bite into it and see what it tastes like. You know, it's supposed to taste a little fishy, but if it's really like, whoa, it's probably rancid, and I would suggest putting it in the trash. You don't want to take rancid fish oil. It's worse to take rancid fish oil than not take any at all. So what are the benefits of fish oil? There are a lot, but when we used to live on the land, we had, well, let me back up for a minute. We only have 2 essential fatty acids in our body. Essential meaning we have to eat them. We cannot make them ourselves. We require these to live, and they're omega-3 and omega-6. So when we used to live on the land, the ratio in our body of omega-3 to omega-6. Now, omega-6 is found in nuts and seeds, a lot in seeds. It's found in vegetable oils. Omega-3 is, like I mentioned, in fish and green leafy vegetables. So when we lived on the land, our ratio of omega-6 to 3 was 5 to 1. Now, this day and age, our ratio is something like 25 to 1, meaning that we have way too much omega-6 to omega-3 because of our diet. We're not eating enough omega-3, and we're eating way too much vegetable oils. It's amazing if you start looking at the ingredients of things that you're eating, and specifically looking for oil. There are so many bad oils in so many in food. You know, soybean oil. Once you start looking in your salad dressings, soybean oil is almost always there. Soybean oil is not a good oil. Cottonseed oil is often in there, not such a good oil. So you can start looking for these things. You don't really want to have any other oils except olive oil. Olive oil's good. And you don't want to overeat olive oil, but olive oil, and they make avocado oil too. Isn't that amazing? And the nice thing about that is that if what I have found, and if anyone wants to go into business to make salad dressing, salad dressing is really missing a good. There's really not very many good salad dressings, even at the health food store, because most have soybean oil in them, and we're getting tons of soybean oil. If we go out to dinner, I can guarantee that they're cooking it in some kind of vegetable oil. They're not using olive oil. It's way more expensive. So every time we go out to dinner, we're getting exposed to all these polyunsaturated fats, which are omega-6, which is why the ratio is so huge. And it causes us for risk for heart disease. It can increase our blood pressure. It also, I'm just going to draw a quick picture, and then I'll finish up talking about fat, and then I'm going to be almost done. We're about to an hour. Okay, so this is an interesting point, because we may not realize how important the kind of fat we eat is. So remember I told you the 2 essential fatty acids that we have to eat that are in our food are omega-6 and omega-3. So sometimes people have thought that, we need omega-6 and we need omega-3. So omega-3 goes into the body and the body converts it into various different chemical substances until at the end we convert it into what's called prostaglandins. And prostaglandins rule a lot of functions in the body. So if we eat good fat, like omega-3, it turns into good prostaglandins. Good prostaglandins reduce inflammation. So if we had surgery, or if we have heart disease, or if we have diabetes, or anything that's related to inflammation, we want to make sure we have a good ratio of omega-3. So it's going to reduce inflammation and pain in the body. So if we have pain in the body, fish oil, omega-3 is really good to do. It also changes our brain chemistry. Omega-3 actually helps increase serotonin production. So for depression and anxiety, omega-3 is really good. Yes. Well, that's a great question. There's actually a lab that has just started looking at people's ratios of omega-3 to 6. And it looks at some other fatty acid components of the body. And when people ask me that, I suggest that we do that test because I don't know what your history has been in terms of how much you've eaten and how much you haven't. And even the generations before you, it gets passed down. So someone may need more omega-3 than the next person. So sorry, I can't directly answer that question. But if we're eating omega-6 and we're overweight or we have insulin resistance, if we don't have insulin resistance and we're not overweight, omega-6 is good. It goes over here and it's lovely. But if we have insulin resistance or high insulin, or we're overweight, we are missing an enzyme to be able to go to this process, and we actually go and make bad prostaglandins. And bad prostaglandins increase inflammation, increase pain, decrease mood, depression goes up, and so saturated fat is also over here too. Saturated fat can go down and make bad prostaglandins as well. Saturated fat has a little more to the story than what I'm telling you. It really has to do with if we're a fat burner, meaning we don't have insulin and blood sugar high floating around all the time, and we're good at burning fat. If we eat saturated fat without any carbohydrates, we're going to burn that as fuel. So it's not as evil as we actually once thought. If we're good at burning fat and we eat saturated fat, we're going to burn it for fuel. If we eat saturated fat with carbohydrates, so like bread and butter. Bread is the carb, and it's going to raise the blood sugar and insulin, and then we're going to store that saturated fat, and we can have more saturated fat floating around in the blood as well. So saturated fat is okay if you're really good at burning fat. Now, how do you? Does anyone have any questions about the fat? Yes. Oh, great question. So is there amount of fat that it is appropriate to eat? Now, this is very interesting. The answer has a lot to do with leptin. So what I suggest, if someone is embarking on a lower carbohydrate diet, is that if they're going to cut out their carbs, a lot of the potatoes and pasta, what you want to do is have in every meal some protein and some good fat. Now, good fat is avocados, olive oil, macadamia nuts, all the things we've been brainwashed to think to stay away from. But we want to eat what we want to burn. We want to burn fat for energy. Since we're taking the carbohydrates out that we're used to burning, we have to replace it with something. So we're going to burn good fat. And in the beginning, it takes a little bit of time, a few weeks, to start having your insulin leptin levels come down. But if you're not eating so much carbs, you can have vegetables. Those are the fibrous carbs, which are good. So veggies, protein, and fat at every meal. You're not going to stimulate your insulin and blood sugar. So that starts to come down, and suddenly the body goes, oh, I can burn the fat on my body. How wonderful. I can burn fat. So when the body starts to burn fat, the appetite changes. So I told you about the receptor sites in the tongue. Taste changes, but appetite suddenly changes because we can now access the fuel on our body anytime we want. We're not panicking and saying, I need to eat for every meal. So we literally actually stop eating so much. We're not as hungry. And so when you ask about how much fat to eat, in the beginning, when we're changing over, I want people to eat as much as they want. If you're hungry, I want you to eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat. So an example throughout the day, and I suggest doing this for 3 weeks at least, but 3 weeks is kind of a good number, eating protein and good fat. And of course, if you want to talk more about this, I can talk to you individually, but protein and fat throughout the day. I don't care if you have to eat 10 times a day if you're hungry, because the goal is to get insulin and leptin levels down. Eating that way will absolutely bring those levels down. And then there will be a point where the body goes, oh, I have fat to burn. I don't have to eat so much. So then we don't need to eat 10 times a day because we're not hungry. We can eat this. We can eat ourselves. So when you ask me how much fat to eat, in the beginning you eat as much as you want. And I know it's scary to think that way. It really is. Especially if we feel hungry all the time. We're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to gain 50 pounds. Trust me, you will not. At very best, you won't lose weight at all for the first 3 weeks, but you will not gain weight. Okay? You will not gain weight. Unless it's water weight, for some reason it might fluctuate. But at the very least, you won't lose a pound. You probably will, but and so the main thing is, if people are hungry, they're going to eat, right? Our genetics are designed that when hunger comes, we are going to eat. Hunger is there to keep us alive. When we lived on the land, if we were hungry, we would forage for food until we died if we had to eat. Now, we don't have to forage for food. So when we're hungry, eventually we're going to eat. We can starve it off for a period of time, but when we're hungry, we will eat. And so that's why I want you to eat when you're hungry. And you're going to eat, the things that are not going to trigger the insulin and leptin levels. So when those start to come down, your appetite shifts. And then the rule is we don't count the amount of calories or grams of fat. We actually eat based on our appetite. And that I know is scary too for us who feel hungry. But literally our whole body chemistry changes and we are not as hungry. I've actually had someone come in and complain, I'm not hungry. That's not very, very common. But so we will eat based on our appetite. So at first we might say, okay, in every meal I'm going to eat. So maybe for breakfast we have a couple of eggs poached and maybe some. I like to put avocado in there. And avocado is so simple to eat. You just cut it open and take a spoon and take some out of the avocado like a spoon, like you're eating right out of the avocado. And you can put a little salt on it. Now, people are afraid of salt too. And the good news about salt is that when you're on a low-carb diet, you can eat more salt. The reason is that when insulin is high and you're eating more carbs, insulin triggers, remember I said the kidneys to hold on to sodium? And wherever sodium goes, water follows. So we hold on to sodium. So some people will say, oh, salt, just, I don't get along with salt. When someone's insulin levels come down, they can eat more salt. And plus, when they're eating low carb, usually they're not eating as much processed food, which tends to have less salt anyway. So you don't have to worry, unless you know you have a particular issue with salt, putting it on your avocado. So sure. Not necessarily, unless you wanted to, unless your sodium levels are low. Or the only reason I've ever told someone to increase salt is sometimes if someone has adrenal fatigue, it can actually help their adrenals a little bit. But in general, you don't need to add it. So some protein and good fat for breakfast, and then for lunch, a salad with plenty of olive oil and some kind of protein. You can put olives. Olives are also a good fat source. So plenty of olives, plenty of olive oil. You don't have to measure it. Just put it on. And then for dinner, some kind of protein. I'm just kind of giving you a basic idea. Unfortunately, the list of good fats are not huge. It's not the longest list. So you try to incorporate all these good fats throughout the day. And then if you're hungry, then you can have like a handful of nuts, small handful of nuts. And if you're hungry, 45 minutes later, have a small handful of nuts. So basically, you're going to eat smaller portions than what maybe we've been used to eating, and you're eating snacks in between if you're hungry. And as soon as the leptin and insulin levels come down, the appetite shifts. So if you have to eat little meals all throughout the day, we can talk more specifics if you want to talk to me later about all the different foods. A really good book that I love that talks a lot about what I'm discussing is called The Rosedale Diet. And he talks all about insulin and leptin and all its relationships to all the diseases, and has lots of recipes and interesting things and ideas for food to eat. And he also recommends certain supplements in there, which I'm not going to get to tonight. But does that answer your question? It's hard to trust that the body will tell you how much to eat. So if you're eating like this after 3 or 4 weeks of cutting out all the carbs, and then the body goes, oh, I can burn fat efficiently, your appetite shifts around, then things will change. If you're eating and you find yourself, wow, I'm really hungry, this is not working for me, it means that you're not eating enough good fat. If you're finding that, wow, I'm not really that hungry, I don't really feel like eating much, then you're eating more than you need, more fat than you need. So the trick is that once you get to your ideal weight, and maybe you're already to your ideal weight, once you get to your ideal weight, then you can actually eat more saturated fat. That's what I was talking about. So, because if we want to lose weight, we're not going to, remember, we store all that sugar as saturated fat, so we don't want to eat what we're trying to get rid of if we want to lose weight. So cutting out the saturated fat in the beginning is a good idea. Later on, when we're at our ideal weight or we feel like, oh, we're in a good place, then we can add the saturated fat back in, and we're going to burn it for fuel, as long as we're not eating it with carbohydrates. Does that make sense? Yes, exactly. It depends on your appetite. And there's a lot of other things involved with appetite, not just, I'm only talking about the physiological aspects of appetite. Now, we all have emotional relationships to food, so we may have an appetite, but it's an emotional appetite. We're hungry, but we're not hungry for food. We're hungry for connection or love or intimacy, but we often eat. So we all have emotional relationships to food, so that's separate from what I'm talking about in terms of physiological hunger. But when you do this, you can start to pay attention, and you can ask yourself, do I think this is actually physiological hunger? Do I really need to eat? Or is this emotional hunger? And even if we don't know the answer, we can just start to ask the question, is this really, am I really hungry? And if we have a lot of extra weight that we're carrying around, we might actually have some self-talk going, you're not really that hungry, you have plenty to burn. Well, the truth is that when we are overweight and insulin and leptin resistance, we are starving in our bodies. We're actually starving because we can't access our fat. So we probably are truly physiologically hungry. Until that insulin and leptin levels come down, we can't really trust our appetite. So we can start to trust our appetite when we are burning fat efficiently. That's when we can actually start to trust our appetite. So in the beginning, in the first 3 weeks, we just decide to trust our appetite by eating as much as we need to, protein and fat, throughout the day. And as soon as that switch turns on, then we can feel the difference. We know it's happening. We see the difference on our body. And we can then start to ask the question, is this physiological hunger or emotional hunger? Mm-hmm. Yes. Absolutely. Well, it's not esoteric. Right. Well, and that is absolutely true. The sensory input is so important, the smell and the taste. I'm only presenting tonight the kind of the scientific portion of it, and so I agree. That's a certain... Yeah. Well, it's certainly important for things to taste good, otherwise we won't do it. And so taste is important. And also then, taste does change when we change our physiology too. So we actually, the things that used to taste really good will change. And actually, a lot of people don't believe me when I say this, is that when people who like to eat a lot of sweets or something sugary, I'll tell them, in a few months of doing this, you'll go out with a friend and have a bite of their dessert, and you'll be amazed at how sweet it tastes. And actually when I was first told that, I didn't believe it. I used to really have a sweet tooth, and it really does switch around. But thank you for that point. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up, and we have a long list here, and I actually didn't write down all the points that we were making along the way. I don't think I actually wrote them all down. But there's so many health benefits to eating a lower carb diet. The thing that you might be walking away with tonight as a question is, well, what does low carb really mean? How much low carb do I really need to do? And if you get the book, you can actually read more about it, or I'm happy to talk with you about that. And for some people, they really do need to cut more than others. So it really is not a rule about how much to do, although the most ideal thing is to cut out a lot of the extra potatoes and pasta and breads and cereals. In fact, we don't even have a physiological need for a carbohydrate. If we didn't eat, it's impossible for that. But we could actually burn all of the fat in our body to use for our brain and for our energy. So we don't actually need carbohydrates, but we like them, as you pointed out. They're good. My whole message tonight is that food is our best medicine. There's no substitution for healthy eating, and if we are eating a diet that is healthy for us, we can pretty much ward off most chronic diseases and slow down the aging process itself. So thank you all for coming. Do you have any questions? Yes, absolutely. You want to keep all your fish oil, even if it's capsules, in the refrigerator. The problem is that if you don't know if it was rancid in the first place, then it doesn't really matter. But if you have fresh fish oil and you put it, then it's good to keep it in the refrigerator. It stays much fresher longer. Yes, the Rosedale Diet book by Ron Rosedale. Yes. Yeah. Well, in fact, great question. In fact, he was asking about orange juice and other juices. In fact, for a diabetic, type 1 diabetic whose blood sugar goes really low because they're taking insulin, and it's an emergency, actually they use orange juice to raise their blood sugar up very quickly. So orange juice, fruit juices are very concentrated amounts of sugar, because if we're having like apple juice, It's not just the one apple with the fiber. It's many apples, concentrated. So juice is really high in sugar. Even if there's no sugar added, it's the fruit sugar. I don't recommend drinking much orange juice. I mean, maybe occasionally for going out to breakfast or something, but yeah. Yes. Yeah. What's that? So yeah, we didn't talk about fruit tonight. That's a whole nother topic. But if you're going to do like the 3 weeks of kind of getting your insulin levels down, I don't recommend much in the way of fruit, except if you want to do the lower carb fruits, which are berries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries. They'll have a lot less sugar than like an orange or pineapple, which will just serve to raise your blood sugar. So if you're really wanting to get your insulin levels down for those first 3 weeks, I would suggest avoiding those fruits. Yeah. Say that again. So would I recommend taking some calcium? I'm sorry. Actually, you can absorb iron just fine without calcium. The best way to absorb iron is there's 2 different forms of iron, heme and non-heme. The iron that's found in vegetables and the iron that's found in red meat. And the best absorbable kind of iron is in red meat. I mean, I don't suggest you eating tons of red meat with saturated fat, but it is, if you're anemic, I do recommend my patients to eat red meat because it will get the iron levels up very quickly. Most supplements are the non-heme form, and it's going to take a while to build up the iron stores if you're going to do it through the vegetable. But you don't need to take calcium with it. It'll just, go right in. The Rosedale Diet by Ron Rosedale, MD. Yes. So I work in the wellness center, and we have a pharmacy just right behind, in a room there behind the desk. And if any of you are interested in having more information, I do a free consult for half an hour to see if we want to work together, or you can make an appointment for an initial appointment, which is an hour and a half. And I will be doing, if this talk has been interesting for you, probably be interested in the heart disease talk because it is very related. As I was mentioning, 50% of heart attack victims have normal cholesterol. So there's actually a specialty lab that we talked about last week that if you have any PPO insurance besides Cigna, it covers it. And it's a no-brainer to get it if you have heart disease risk in your family or high cholesterol, because it looks at all the different other factors that are related to heart disease, because we are falsely thinking that we're protected from heart disease just because our cholesterol might be normal, but that's not the case. And a lot of people walk around with their doctors told them their cholesterol's high, but they just go, well, maybe I can change this with diet, but it's still, it's kind of lingering around, and they wonder, what should I do? And so what we can do is look at all the other risk factors to see how important it is to really get this down quickly. Are there other risk factors? So if you're interested in that talk or learning more about that, you can walk over to your name and put like an X by your name, and we can send you more information about when the next talk might be. We don't draw blood, but we order blood. So we do a lot of ordering for blood. Send you off to the lab. Yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you very much.